The Age of Chivalry, Chapter 13, Section 3. So, knights were professional fighters. Their full-time job was to protect the land of their lords, and they were required to fight somewhere along the lines of 40 days a year. Now, that might seem like not many working days, right, when you consider there's 365 days a year, but keep in mind, this is kind of like a professional athlete schedule, right? The amount of wear and tear on the body is quite a bit from combat, so they need quite a bit of rest as well as quite a bit of preparation in order to fight, which is why this low number of 40 days of combat a year. Now, knights were following something known as chivalry, which meant they devoted themselves to their lord, their god, and their chosen lady. Now, this was only in theory because in reality, we're talking about young men who had a lot of physical power, whose jobs depended on violence. So, a lot of historians may say that in reality, kind of like the samurai in Japan, a lot of the knights perhaps were not quite as chivalrous as some of the writing portrays them as, and I'll go on to talk about that writing later on. So what did a life of a knight look like? Well, they began training from a young age, about age 7. Interestingly enough, the same age as when Spartans began to train. And we send our children to first grade, so there's something about 7 years old sort of being the start of training. Anyways, they'd go on and serve under a knight, where they would serve as basically a helper of a knight. And this goes on to about age 21. And then once they officially achieve knighthood, they spend their first years actually going around different areas to fight in different tournaments and go on and get fighting experience firsthand. Once they get those few years in, then they're really considered sort of as a seasoned and a knight that's usable in battle. Now, there's a slight difference between a vassal and a knight. Most knights are coming from rich families. They're wealthy. So almost all knights are vassals, but not all vassals are knights. So what I mean by that is that all knights come from a wealthy family to a certain degree, but not all those who are in wealthy families choose to go the knight path. Now, this goes back to a point I mentioned earlier about chivalry. A lot of the writing that was made during this period was directed towards the rich, whether it be the lords or the ladies of the knights. And these type of writings, whether it's poems, essays, often portray the knights in a positive light because they wanted to show these people that they were fighting for that they were doing good chivalrous deeds. But in reality, as I mentioned earlier, as history shows, when you give young men a lot of power and their life revolves around violence, there tends to be a tendency of it being abused, at least by some. And a good example of some literature about knights can be seen in King Arthur, where, of course, knights are portrayed in a very positive light to the most part. Now, during this time, there's also a major invention that helps advance knighthood in regards to its fighting. We have leather saddles that come all the way from China, and this invention that was created in China makes it to Europe, and it makes it much easier to knights to fight on horse. Now, the state of women during this period was not great. Women in feudal societies had hardly any power, and even if you were a noble woman, you are in a very disadvantageous position because you did not have a guarantee of land being passed on, because your land could be passed on to your sons if you were married and your husband passed away. Now, one of the more famous groups of knights was the Knights of Templar, who fought during the Crusades. These knights wore white mantles with red crosses across their chests and fought during the Crusades. One of the more famous battles they fought was the Battle of Montesquieu, where 500 Knights of the Templar defeated over 20,000 Muslim soldiers. That is it on knights. In the future, we will look at another group sort of similar to the knights, the samurai, who existed around the same time period as the knights, had very similar points, but also had some major differences, and we'll look at those in greater depth when we follow Japan. Copyright disclaimer under section 107. That is it with the knights. See you later. Have a nice day. Goodbye.
It's so bright, strawberry champagne on us. Lucky for you, that's what I like. That's what I like. Lucky for you, that's what I like. That's what I like.